Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. If you joined us before, you will notice that today I'm Nelson-less. Normally I'll be joined by Nelson, but he's not with us today. But I have two great guests. We're going to dive into this topic of HR trends everybody needs to know for next year. The reason they're trends everybody needs to know is because although they're HR trends or trends that HR can kind of take the lead on, they're also things that everyone else can help drive through behavior change and how we all act. So really interested to dive into this topic. To give you a bit of context, the basis for these trends is I spent far too long reading every single report I could find from about June onwards, coming up with these sort of common themes I noticed, interesting data points I hadn't seen before. And that's how I kind of settled on 7 trends, but we're going to talk about 4 of those today. Then we're going to go into some research from Emma and Carly. So best intro, Emma and Carly. Emma Leonis-Hughes is Client Executive Director of HR Transformation at Lace Partners. Carly Poulson is People and Culture Partner at Unleash. So welcome both of you to the show.
Thanks, Gary.
Hello. Thanks,
so I think we're going to get to, obviously, like I said, your research that you conducted later in the show, and that might be a good time to kind of talk a bit more about who you are and what you do. But it might be cool to really get into one of these topics and pick your brains. So the first one would be, how do HR teams and organizations support employees under financial pressure? So one thing I noticed in the research was that although we're seeing things we might expect, like employee stress is at an all-time high, more than half of people were saying they were burnt out. There were some new numbers around financial pressures. So 59% of respondents stated that they were stressed by their monetary situation and that was having a spillover into work. 46% were uncomfortable talking about it at work. And then 17% of people, worst of all, felt resigned to the fact their employer couldn't do anything about it to support them. So, yeah, I'm curious, like, how do we start tackling this? What are your thoughts on this? Maybe Emma, we'll start with you and then we'll bring in Carly.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. It's a really interesting one because I was sort of doing some research as well. And I think actually finances are now the top cause of stress outside work, kind of to build on what you said, which might not have been the case, I suppose, 12, 18 months ago. We've seen a lot in the press around sort of one-off payments, £1,000, for example, in some of the airlines, increasing base salary, the mix of variable and fixed based pay, which is good. But I guess my view of that is that's only one thing. And actually, sometimes that's quite a short-termist way of looking at something. And not every company has that ability. If you're a small organization, you might not be able to sustain that uplift in salaries, for example. So for me, it's about what more can you do that's quite holistic. That's something that we're thinking about as well, because I lead our people proposition for Lace. So effectively, I've got an internal role as much as I work with HR transformation, clients from a client delivery side. For example, we've got Royal London as our pension provider. A lot of pension providers will actually run free webinars on financial wellbeing. It's making people aware that that's available for them, because a lot of the time I think our teams, they just don't know what is there, and that's free. It's available. Some banks do the same thing. And I remember I was talking to an organization, they're with Barclays. Barclays do the same thing. Again, if you've got that facility, just communicate that so that someone can go and have that conversation. And maybe employee discount schemes. So we use Charlie HR. It's a small platform compared to others like Workday, for example, and the other kind of big tier 1 HCMs. But they have employee discount schemes as part of their perks. Some of it's around holidays, others might be around cinema. There's things around some travel as well, all really good. And I guess for me and Carly, we can kind of go back and forth on other thoughts with this one. But fundamentally, if you've already got some things that are available, people just might not know. So communicate what is available. Plus also there are other things that clearly we can consider as well. But I'll let Carly join in versus me going on a bit of a monologue about all of my thoughts.
No, I completely agree with most, all the things you sort of said there, Emma. I think there's it's a big challenge for companies at the moment, and knowing kind of the role they play in it, and ultimately, if they're in a financial position to be able to help and support in some ways, but there are lots of ways that they can support that might not cost them very much, right? And you talked a lot about financial kind of education, right? I mean, I was never taught, like, financial education at school is shocking. You don't know what your an ISA is until you kind of are thrust into adult life, and somehow you have to figure it all out for yourself. And the CIPD did like research on this a few years ago, like, launched a big report in, like, I guess, the 4 biggest stresses at work, and personal finance is one of them for sure. And so there's some great companies out there, like I was thinking of like Bipit, for instance, who are doing sort of free webinars and stuff around personal finances. You can look at Female Invest, for instance, who are doing like free webinars or on like ISAs, or how to start investing if you're in that position. You know, Octopus Money Coach as well. So there's all these options that you can kind of put forward to your team members, and I'll kind of bring in to do some really kind of education around, okay, what is your personal financial situation, and how can we kind of help you on that front? I mean, with the cost of living crisis, obviously it's just going to be front of everyone's minds. And I think it's really difficult for businesses to kind of navigate some of this. It's quite a difficult topic for them all. You know, what's the role I play in this? Do we look at inflation? Do we look at spot bonuses? Who do we support the most? How, like, and that ties back to kind of your pay philosophy and what you believe as a company, and how best you can support your employees. I think, if I had to say there was a bits of advice, you know, start by offering education, ask the people what they want and what support they need. Like, go out to your team and ask them. You know, there's a lot of focus on kind of coming up with solutions, but don't do it in isolation. And then communicate, absolutely communicate what you're in a position to be able to do. And don't ignore it. Like, really don't ignore the topic, because you know, people will be seeing their colleagues, their friends, their family members being told they're getting more flexibility for travel, for instance. They don't have to travel at peak time, so it doesn't cost as much money, or they'll be getting a spot bonus that will support them, or they'll be talking a lot about carpooling, or whatever those options are. And if you're sat there thinking, well, my company hasn't said anything to me about this, maybe they don't care. I think it's far from that, but we're just sort of burying our heads in the sand, and actually we need to be quite open about what we can and can't do.
Yeah, it's a great point, because at the end of the day, it's like anything. People talk, you look at what other companies are doing and you use that as a reference point. And a lot of the time there is that kind of, if you don't do something, you are burying your head in the sand a little bit. And something to just come back to there, we often talk about L&D, like coming from an L&D perspective, being in the business of behavior change. And like you said, that education, that awareness can help that. But also, like you alluded to there, have to know which behavior we're going to try and change. So it's not a big blanket like financial pressure for people. There's like some people that, like you said, will be struggling with travel costs. Some people with childcare costs, some people with, maybe it's like repaying loans, like student loans, like all these other things that they might need to help move the needle on. But I guess one thing I wanted to pick your brains about was this idea that 17%, or actually 46% of people didn't really feel comfortable talking about it at work. And therefore, if we can't get people necessarily to open up, we actually can't diagnose where the problem lies. So how could we approach that? I mean, I guess the obvious answer is like anonymous feedback, but I'm guessing that there's maybe something we can elaborate on there.
I think it's about making it feel a safe environment. I think that, you know, a lot of us just in general, I'm not comfortable, you know, talking to my friends about finances. It's not just, you know, confined to the workspace, is it? And some of that's a cultural thing as well, actually. You know, in the UK, we're quite reserved. Other countries may or may not be exactly the same. But that comes down to one of the age-old challenges, and Gary, I know we've talked about this before around, you know, your leaders and your line managers, creating that environment where people do feel that they can open up, that they're not going to be judged, that you normalise the fact that it is okay to effectively not be okay about some of these things. And it's actually part of, I think, a broader conversation. This isn't just about financial well-being. This is about employee well-being. So merging it into that whole piece, because if you're stressed financially, that's going to have an impact on your mental health, your physical health, all of those types of things. Easier said than done, but I do think, you know, those behaviours of line managers and team leads are really important. And sometimes, you know, just having that anonymous individual you can go and speak to, which comes back to maybe the financial coach that, you know, you gave some examples of, Carly, for example, like Octopus. I think is really important.
Yeah. I mean, you know, creating that psychological safety And that's down to like leaders and leaders playing those roles, right? And showing, showing their, again, communicating and showing their vulnerability too. Like everyone's going to be impacted differently, but if the leaders of the business are able to talk about it in a way, that shows that either that they're understanding that how difficult it is, maybe they're impacted, maybe they're not, but maybe they've got close relatives that are impacted or whatever it is, we're all dealing with it in different ways. So I think there has to be an element of vulnerability there and creating that space for it. So, and being able, confident and in sharing that in those situations, I think is super, super important. And like, I'm a big believer in my own kind of financial independence. And this is a kind of hardwired in me from my background, my upbringing, etc. And it really hits me. This is something that really hits me when I feel financial pressure. I really do feel it, and I feel the weight of it, and feel it quite deeply. But I also, with the team at Unleashed, we kind of do like a daily rag sort of thing with like red, amber, green, how we're feeling today. And I will quite openly say sometimes, oh, this is, my mortgage is going to go up by X in a couple of months' time. But I felt comfortable saying it to the team that I'm in and kind of just sharing that. And I think that's just to shows how good, that leadership is valued, and that kind of sharing and feeling safe to do so is so important.
Yeah, exactly. It comes back to something we spoke about. Anyone who joined us last week would have heard we had Richard on from Assemble You, and they create podcast style learning for like courses and so on. And we spoke about internal podcasts, and sometimes it's also like the medium is the message. Like if you're trying to convey vulnerability, like just a faceless email to someone might not work. Like you have to think about what's the topic at hand and what's the best way to communicate it. Something like a podcast, a short video someone films on their phone, it is a lot more open, and people can really feel that from the leaders that they're okay talking about it. And yeah, I think sometimes that's what's useful, thinking about how you communicate it as well, not just, I guess sometimes there's a tendency to think, oh, we sent something out and our job is done, but you have to think a bit more about that, especially applying like a marketing mindset to that. Like, how do I reduce the friction for someone to access this resource? How do I reduce the tedium of trying to read this? Like, I don't want to read 4,000 words about anything, to be honest with you. So just send me like bullet points and I'll pick up the rest from there. This leads us quite nicely into the next topic, really, because one thing I found particularly interesting was a change in dynamic in company culture and how people want to experience relationships at work. So there was a complete 180 in the stats from pre-pandemic to the most recent I could find. But about December 2019, people said that they were 10 times more likely to stay at a company for relationships than money. Fast forward to the most recent, it was the last factor in job satisfaction. So relationships with managers and co-workers polled at like 11%. Compensation was a clear winner at 43%, even above, I think, 10% or so percentage points above the second place. So there seems to be a shift as well. And how we manage this is probably the question, but people want to experience company culture on different terms. I do actually have some reasons from the research, but before I give you bias about what they are, I'm just curious, maybe Carly, let's start with you, but are people engaging with like company culture differently now? Do relationships have a different role at work?
So I guess my answer to that would be, I think it depends. just in the same way that, people will engage with it in different ways. And I think we have to be, people have different needs, different expectations. And I think we have to be comfortable with accepting that. I think one of the things that I've found, from kind of when I first started out in people and in HR, that it felt very kind of rigid and standardized, that you were trying to make sure that everyone had the same experience and the same things. And it was like the same forms, the same structures, the same. And actually, we're all different. We all have different needs. We all like different ways of working. I'm more creative at night. I can just get in the zone. And it's just, so if I can have that flexibility, it works really well for me. So I think we all have different needs. And I think it's the same when it comes to kind of building out whatever it is that, I guess, when we're talking about relationships and connection, right, in organizations, because culture isn't just that, right? We know it's far more than that. And this is just one part of it. But actually giving people the options to engage with it in the ways that they feel comfortable engaging with it. I found it really interesting, the stat that it came last, and in particular around like culture. I think depending on when this kind of data was pulled, the financial piece and the 43%, like putting finances top, if you're worried about your finances and you're able to go and find another job where you're going to get paid more, you're going to, like, if that's a stressor there. But equally, purpose and culture still play a fundamental part in people joining and staying in organizations. So part of your attraction and retention strategy. And like, if you are, if you're going to treat people like shit, they're going to go. They will leave. And we've seen it this week. And I don't know if you've been reading about this, but obviously with Twitter being laid off and like 50% of staff going, and then all of a sudden getting phone calls asking them to come back in because they realized they made a mistake. I don't know how many have gone back in, but I can imagine you got that phone call, you're gonna be like, no, you just make me feel awful. You've put me something through really quite traumatic and difficult, and now you want me to come back. I don't think I will, thanks. But it's nice of you to ask, but I'm good. So yeah, I think my advice on these things would be clear about what you expect as a company. If you have a culture where you want people to be really part of a community and you expect them to be in X amount of days a week and you expect them to take part and you want them to opt in and be part of all these things, be clear about that if that's what you're expecting. Ask people what they want and how they want to do things, and then accept that not everybody will want to, and they will engage in the things that they want to take part in. And what was my final point? Something to do, but kind of that there will be kind of subcultures. There will be people who are super engaged and there'll be others who won't, and that's absolutely fine. They'll do what matters most to them.
Yeah, it's like fostering the natural behaviour. Actually, I think this is another thing we talk about often. But do you need to shape the culture, or do you need to go and find where it exists? And if it's evolved naturally over time, you can't really necessarily go now and say this is our culture. Actually, your people are creating the culture every day, and then they will tell you what it is, right? So if people don't, they stop coming to social events after work, or people stop scheduling meetings before 10 because they're not morning people. Like, these are the things that happen. But Emma, what are your thoughts on this idea around the change in relationship with culture?
I mean, I fully agree with everything Carly said, and I think that statistic is purely probably a combination of the environment that we're in right now. I think if you ask that in 2 years ago or 2 years from now, hopefully it would be a flip, I'd like to think. But for me, you've got to have conscious interventions, because if you don't consciously think about these things, then you're going to either end up with everybody doing something completely different and no one really feels connected in any shape or form because everybody's doing things that are different. It doesn't feel fair. Well, that team over there went out for lunch, or that team over there did this. We haven't had anything. So there's got to be an element of consciousness. But ultimately, Carly, for me, hit the nail on the head when she said, you've got to ask people what they want, because not everybody wants the same. We talked about that from the financial well-being side. Not everybody wants the same in terms of an experience, and experience links very nicely to culture. So what is it that's working? Why are things not working? You might have face-to-face events. Well, don't assume they're all in London. We all have different, places we live now. A lot of us have moved outside of London. So how are you keeping those subcultures, back to Carly's point, kind of integrated, connected? But it also comes to behaviours. Back to that point again, I think of leadership behaviours too, because they ultimately do create the culture of an organisation and the subcultures within those teams. But asking, being transparent, listening to feedback. I know that's something we're probably going to come on to shortly, Gary, so I won't go into that in too much detail now, but it's very connected, isn't it? Because if you ask for something and don't act on it, well, okay, I'm not going to feel so engaged now, and I don't really understand what it is we stand for, because you're not constantly reinforcing that, constantly communicating that. Hence that conscious element, I think, is very important too, that reinforcement piece.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you're right, there's something we're going to come to next. But I guess what I'll just quickly summarize, I think we touched on most of it there, actually. The reasons in the reports that this seemed to be happening: one, remote employees felt less connected to culture naturally. So we kind of talked about that a bit more in terms of what's a good fit for your company where it is right now. Ask people if they're remote. On a similar note, more than half of those remote employees said they were unlikely to attend voluntary events in the future that were employer organised. So again, it's like people want it on their terms, and if it's a 2-hour journey, of course they're unlikely to want to attend, right? And then one other interesting one, and it comes back to what you said about redundancies there, Carly, but people in companies with high turnover are now starting to think it's less worthwhile to get to know their co-workers. So I guess it's like that thing, if there's constant churn, do you really it takes a lot of effort and energy to get to know people well, doesn't it? And build up a rapport. And if it's a kind of a revolving door, then we do end up with a bit of an issue there. I actually, no, go ahead.
Yeah, you go, Carly. I think both of us are surprised by that last point. Go for it, Carly.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, people will go and work places where whatever matters them to happens, I guess. So if I think about companies where I've heard of like really kind of horrific cultures, right? And there are people, and sometimes it's really public, and it's people know. But they'll opt in, right? They'll decide to go and work for those companies because, I don't know, they're a rocket ship, and the experience they're going to get there in the space of a year, they'll suck it up for a year if they think it's awful, and they'll go in and do it. And the reason they're there is, this is going to propel me to X, Y, Z, where I want to get to. And actually, that's what matters to me right now. If I can deal with it for a year to 18 months, that's fine. And I think people will ultimately choose what matters to them most. And if they know that their culture's like that, but they're opting into that, that's a choice they're making. It's a similar way to, going to somewhere if you've been in a toxic culture and actually you're like, I do not want to work in any kind of environment like that ever again. You're going to be really conscious of asking those cultural questions and really kind of assessing that when you're going into interviews with anyone else. And then the point of just quickly around connection, I think about building relationships is kind of creating opportunities for connection. And kind of being conscious in like the options that are there to connect and create that kind of connection. But again, people will connect in different ways. I've worked with engineering teams who create socials to online to do sort of online gaming or whatever it is, to create that kind of connection in that way. So they're all kind of connecting through playing a game. I've got someone actually organising their offsite next week, and they're going to be doing sort of Lego building, etc. Create that kind of a connection. But other people will connect in different ways through just having a coffee or a virtual coffee is another way of connecting, and that's fine. So I guess it's kind of making sure people are aware of what's okay, what's possible, and how it's supported. I might have waffled on a little bit on those 2 points.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I was just going to comment, Gary, on that point that you made around, companies with a high turnover. So people that work in those environments are just like, well, why bother getting to know Carly, right? I've been working with Carly, but why bother get to know Carly or Gary? Actually, I find that really quite saddening, actually. I'd love to understand with the high turnover piece, what's driving that? Now, if that's toxic behaviors, as we've given some examples of, completely kind of get that, because it's kind of like, well, I'm not really going to stay here anyway, so why would I bother? But if it's high turnover in the sense of, fast-paced environment, the average tenure is 2 years, for example, because that's just the nature of the business, it's not because of leadership. That is really sad if people genuinely feel like that. And I think as people leaders, the people function, the HR function has a real job in actually addressing that, because there's so much value in making sure people do feel that they're connected. It's like, we don't want you to feel like that. 2 years is normal here, for example. It's not a bad thing. Do get connected. If they don't want to, then that's absolutely fine. But I'm saddened by that statistic, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think part of the problem as well, a lot of the time people don't find this out until someone's leaving the company. So this is going to come into the next point around feedback, but unless you have a good feedback mechanisms for people to flag when this stuff is happening, then the only time they're really going to tell you is when they leave in an exit interview, and then nothing can be done about it. So it's kind of, it's pretty demoralizing really as a stat. I missed a perfect segue earlier to tell people about the next episode, because Emma, you mentioned about leaders setting examples, and next time we're talking about leading and learning in flat organizations. So we often talk about them as like an unalloyed good, like democratizing knowledge sharing, everyone's on the same plane, but actually it's a more nuanced subject. There's challenges that come to that, expectation setting, how we work together, processes. So if anyone's interested in that, I'll put the link in the chat now, and you can just pretend that I said this 20 minutes ago when that was the perfect segue time. I'm normally good on the segues.
Is he editing this?
I'm gonna be like a really poor edit. There'll be like a quick jump to like me with no cardigan on, completely seamless. Just drop that in the chat now. But that would be a really good session, and again, it'd be great to see some of you there and hear your thoughts and questions. But to come on to that, now we're going to come back to the previous good segue, and not as far apart this time. But one of the stats I found was around feedback culture, really, and it was that people don't think HR teams are listening enough. So 85% of HR staff think that they use feedback to improve the employee experience, but only 50% of staff agree. Only 14% of people think their employer uses the feedback effectively to drive change. And 70% of staff said they had little or no influence on how things were done at their company. So I guess there's really a disconnect. But what I'm curious to know is it that we're not collecting feedback in the right way? Is it that we're not actioning it in the right way? Or is it that we're not communicating it in the right way? Or is it sadly all three?
It's got to be all three, surely.
All three.
Yep.
Well, where do you think we can go with this? Because we did allude to it a little bit, like thinking more about what's a good cultural fit for how you collect feedback. But I guess it's like, how can we make it more of a day-to-day thing? How do we make sure it doesn't, like, it's not just your performance review where you get a chance to talk about this, or biannual surveys where like something happened to you like week one after the last survey and you've been fostering, like that's been festering for 5.5 months, and finally you're letting rip on like Survey Monkey, like 7,000 words and letting all that out. But yeah, Emma, what do you think on this topic?
Yeah, so for me, it goes back to, you've got teams within teams. So it's great that people might do Great Place to Work. We do that at LACE. We've just run our annual survey, for example. Others will do, other annual surveys, biannual, whatever that looks like. But we also have a concept of an ambassador group. So that's, a group of individuals that cut across our organization, different levels, different teams. And they get together with me as people kind of director for LACE every sort of 6 weeks. And the first thing we always talk about is, what's the word on the street? So how are your teams feeling? And what are you hearing? So these aren't always managers. These are people who might be brand new into the organization as, grads, as analysts, all the way through up to kind of senior managers and beyond. Hence, that cross-section is really important. And it's something super simple to do. You could even do that as a team lead, quite frankly. If you're managing a team of, a couple of hundred people, why would you not do that? It doesn't have to sit with the people function to do it. It's lovely if it does, because then you've naturally got that sort of direct view, I guess, back into the business of what's kind of coming up. But it's something super simple. We trial ideas, we get feedback, looking at our benefits, all that kind of thing. Like if we changed it, what would kind of things that you'd like to see be? And we then feed that back up as an exec team as well. So I think that's something super simple that any organization could do, no matter how big or how small, for example. But yeah, I do see personally the disconnect when I work with HR functions externally as a consultant, hence my double hat role, I suppose, internal and external, in that HR thinks it does a great job because it's asking for net promoter score. Yay, brilliant. Doesn't actually tell you that much, to be quite honest. It will tell you, yes, you've got some detractors, or you've got X% of people who are really positive, but it's the why. And the only way you're going to get to the why is if you actually ask people. And even doing that through a survey, it's anonymous, unless you can really get to the rub of the issue through talking to people, you're not going to really be able, I don't think, to get the anecdotal information that you need. So that blend, I guess, is really important through surveys and the conversations.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's it's about that, again, what we spoke about earlier, not just thinking your job is done once the survey is back out, and you get the responses. I think it's like thinking about when you do it as well. You don't always, even if you sent one, say you sent one 2 weeks ago and then like some big news comes out around redundancies, like send one again, maybe. Thinking about that, you just reminded me actually before we come to Carly, you see my short-term memory problem, so I best say this before I forget. But actually in one of my old companies, we had this system where once a month there was like a big company meeting, but it was just one person from each department plus the company like directors and so on. And that person in the department was like the point of contact for everyone else. So the month that I did it, everyone could come to me in private with their concerns. I would go and represent them anonymously to the rest of the company, and we would all have an input. And it was kind of like a two-pronged thing, like one person, it builds trust between like the person who's the point of contact and the rest of the team. It gives everyone a voice at different times of the year to come to the company. So I guess that was a good example of a culture fit that I just wanted to share before we move on. But yeah, Carly, what are your thoughts around this feedback culture?
So a couple of things, right? Emma, you touched on gave a really good example of something there that's quite easy to set up and do and get that kind of qualitative feedback, which I think, we get, as you say, sort of measuring EMPS scores is really helpful. Everyone's kind of got a Peakon or a culture amp or an office vibe or whatever it is that you're using, or your HRS system, like that can support that, which is great. And often you'll get the scores, it'll give you trends, which is obviously really useful. I think the meat is obviously in the qualitative feedback that you get. And actually in a previous company I worked with, we spent a lot of time in working with directors and managers, etc., going through the qualitative feedback and actually responding to it, or asking for more, like, and what else, or actually, would you be open to actually having a conversation with me about this, because I would really like to understand this more. So really making a conscious effort to dig into the qualitative feedback. So, I mean, if you're collecting that data and not use it, I mean, what a waste of money on those systems if you're not. And then I was really surprised around the kind of point around this disconnect, right? Which was, I'm a big believer in transparency and communication. So, like, if you've got those scores and you've got some anonymized comments and stuff, use them and present them back to your team. Tell them what's happening. Be open about these things. It's going to give you so much more insight afterwards. And then once you're kind of able to discuss these things, ask again, either there and then. Some people might not be willing to share what they're feeling. They might feel too intimidated or whatever that is. Give them different means of kind of sharing more feelings, whether it's a conversation in a meeting like you talked about, Emma, and things, and having a representative do that for you, or if you've got an anonymous kind of AMA channel in your Slack, for instance, to kind of add in different comments or thoughts. What was the other thing I had in mind? Even offer up, one-to-ones to explore something in more detail. It's just help people feel more comfortable sharing some of this insight and stuff and getting really into the detail of what's happening. And then I think my final thing around transparency and communication, I think my final thing is, again, if you're taking this feedback and then you start building something and then you come back and go, here you go, there's your disconnect. Like if you're not involving, you're asking them for feedback, but then you're not taking your users and building it. And, we talk about people as product, and, there's some great stuff out there, and there's a book coming out by Jess and all this kind of stuff, like really thinking about who your users are and who you're building for, and getting them involved in that building process so that they actually can see the progress. They can see constantly that it ties back to the results that their feedback and their insights that they've shared. And that's everything that kind of we work on. We at Unleash, we take a design thinking approach to everything we do, and we involve volunteers from teams to come forward and help us create things that are going to support them in relation to what they need.
They become your advocates, don't they? Your advocates for change as well. Yeah,
for sure.
No, exactly.
Change management has been a topic of discussion for years. There's theory around like Kotter and Lewin and all this kind of stuff, and communication. Fundamental.
There's a theme that kind of runs through this actually, because it starts with what Emma said about what's the word on the street. So people who are already advocates for the feedback culture will be showing you. People are already sharing feedback. Like there might be a Slack channel where you see someone post like a frustration 3 or 4 times, right? You can pick up on that without them telling you. You can see if someone comes to you with an idea and then you action it, and then you can see a positive response in them. Why not see if they can communicate it to the rest of the business? I took this to senior management. They actioned it. Now we have this new policy in place. Let them speak about it because they're advocates. And it's like people who joined before would have heard me and Nelson talk about positive feedback loops quite a lot, but this is a good example of that. If you give a bit of feedback and then you see that it actually drives some tangible change, you're more likely to give feedback in the future, because I know we spoke about this, Carly, actually, but you can send surveys till you're blue in the face, but the less you action the findings from the survey, the less you're going to see quality in responses. Yeah,
sure. And like pulse checks, right? You were talking about the space between getting those kind of insights and things. If you can do frequent check-ins, and obviously it depends on how big your team is, how much capacity there is to deal with all this data coming in all the time. But we, for example, our internal team at Unleashed, we have our Friday pulse, and every Thursday we're asked to answer a set of questions and celebrate some wins from the week, and then we talk about them in our team meeting. And then we're asked to share any frustrations or anything, or why maybe our score might be slightly less than the week before, and is anyone in the team willing to share like why that might be? Now we're a small team, we're a very close team, very connected team, and feel very comfortable. I think feel very psychologically safe to be able to talk about these things very openly. But even if you're in a team that hasn't quite got that level of trust, I guess, then, but still being able to track on a more frequent cadence and getting those touch points, that's going to really help you as an indicator of when, you need to explore things more or not.
And I think the timeliness of the action, as we've said, is really important. So yes, you've got to take some action, otherwise I'm not going to bother giving you feedback anyway next time. But also sometimes we worry about getting a perfect solution to something. Actually, doing something is better than doing nothing. And when I speak to sort of people directors, they go, I've got all these things I need to deal with. I'm like, yep, and you do need to deal with those. But let's try and sequence this. So every quarter you're doing something. So you're showing progress, you're actioning on it, you're getting feedback on how did it land? Did it not land? Experienced teams are now existing in HR functions or people functions, or even more broadly. That's what their role is. Their role is to get feedback, listen on it, look through the end-to-end experience. What does the people function own? How do I change my recruitment process? Or all of those kind of things. So I guess, start small. Which goes back to some of those change management principles, but doing something small, showing progress is brilliant. It's better than doing nothing at all, or trying to wait till you've got the perfect solution, which 6 months down the line probably isn't relevant anymore anyway.
No, that's one of my favorite sayings, that one, like a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow, if you need something doing today, right?
Never.
never reach a perfect plan, or never.
It's just that 50%, right? That's huge.
Mm-hmm.
That's massive. Feeling that they don't have any influence or say. That's wow.
Yeah, it's an eye-opening one, really. I think it's this is what I found for a lot of these stats. Actually, there was some really sad stuff to see in there that you would have thought, considering the amount of times we talked about some of these things as if they're just like buzzwords and then they're gone, but actually they're long-term things. One thing I want to remind people of is, if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. We do have one more talking point, but I'd actually like to get into maybe some of the findings from your research to make sure that we don't run out of time to do this. So basically this is probably the time as well to explain a bit about who you are and what you do. Emma, I know you recently published some research, and Carly, you're in the process of sort of finalizing some. So Emma, maybe let's start with yourself. I know basically for people who don't know, you recently created this HR's One Big Thing report. So maybe just tell us a bit more quickly about LACE, what the report is, and some of the big findings from that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. So LACE, we're a boutique HR transformation consultancy. So we work with people directors every single day of our lives in LACE, really helping them figure out, so what are your priorities? What does that mean in terms of linking back to your business strategy? And how do you kind of do the right thing, I guess, for your teams and your employees? So that could be lots of different things. It could be implementing a new system for HR. It could be fundamentally changing the talent attraction process, for example, and your philosophy around that. Loads of different dimensions. As I said earlier, I have a dual role, so I actually lead our own EVP internally for LACE because we're a growing business. So that's quite exciting. I have to practice what I preach to my clients and hopefully do that in a good way. Fingers crossed. That's a bit embarrassing. But one of the things that we're passionate about, and actually it's one of our kind of core 3 values as a company at LACE, is innovation. So very recently, I think about sort of 3-4 weeks ago, we published a kind of snapshot report called One Big Thing, which you just mentioned, Gary. And that was really essentially asking chief people officers one question. Over the next 12 to 24 months, so next 1 to 2 years, if you could fix just one thing related to people in your organization, what would that be? So we went just to CPOs. We're very conscious of getting the right level of input with the surveys that we do and research that we do. So we had responses from 30 different organizations that covered, I think it's 500,000 employees, so quite sizable in terms of the organizations that responded. And the 2 top things, that there were 3 overall, but 2 stood out more than any that kind of came out, were talent attraction. So 36% of those CPOs said talent attraction is the one thing. Not surprising in some respects, although we did do this kind of analysis over July, August, and sort of into early September. So a little bit before we're now in the state of the economy that we are in some respects. And then the second top piece, which 30% of the CPOs said, was flexible working and hybrid, which actually personally for me is quite an interesting one, because that's not something new. We've been talking about that since the start of the pandemic 2 years ago. So what is it that kind of, sits beneath that? Is it just we haven't got the right policies in place yet? Our leaders are now starting to mandate that you've got to come back 2-3 days a week and actually fixing the days. I've heard of that. There's been some examples of that in the press, which probably links back to the point around culture that we've already talked about earlier on. And then also employee value proposition came up as well, which sort of 13% of those CPOs said. So they were the top 3 kind of overall themes, I guess. And there's so much that sits behind those. Talent attraction is all around, am I offering the right employee value proposition in the first place to get people in the door? Is my recruitment process slick enough? Am I looking at talent from the right sources? All of those things. So over the course of the next kind of 2-3 months, we're going to take each of those topics and actually deep dive into them, do some webinars, do some podcasts, write some blogs to give some real kind of advice as to some of the things that you can consider. But yeah, the flexible working one really struck me as that's interesting, given that we are 2 years into doing that. So really keen to delve into that more.
Yeah, no, I found that actually in some other research that there was still like this big disconnect, especially with learning between remote and in-person employees. So there was like, I think it was having access to a space to learn and having time to learn. There was like this big disparity between how easy it is for people in person to find that versus how easy it is for people who still work remotely. So I don't think we've figured it out quite yet, have we, even now? I've already read the report, so I'd love to hear Carly's thoughts on any of what Emma just said there.
I mean, interestingly, I find it really fascinating because it's somewhat different to the results that that we've been going through in the research that we've got, and I think it's because of the nature of the organisations that we're working with, right? But I think your point about hybrid working and remote and all of that, I think that's going to carry on, and I would agree. And even though it hasn't actually come up in our results so far from what we've seen and what we're uncovering. Companies are still trying to work this out. They're still trying to work out how it fits, and ways of working around it, because there's still frustrations and niggles with it all. And I think that there's still, because every company is slightly different and will have slightly different needs and different approaches to it. I think it's keep testing and tweaking and trialing it. And I don't think anyone's got a perfect solution for it yet. To be perfectly honest. Yeah. So I'm not surprised that that's on there. Yeah. But it's quite interesting, I think, and particularly around your other point around talent attraction as well. That's certainly in light of the trends we've seen in the last few weeks and months, I would say, and certainly with the amount, I mean, for anyone being impacted by layoffs and stuff at the moment, and particularly TA teams, like, it's a really tough time. And then when you see that stat around people focusing on talent attraction, you're like, well, who's going to do it if you haven't got your TA teams, right? Like, and your EVP, like, it's similar thing. Like, this is what TA teams do. So yeah, really interesting. I'm looking. Well, you have to send it to me so I can read it. I haven't read it.
Yeah, we'll make sure we're going to send an email out after this is finished with links to the recordings. We'll include some of the links to the research there, links to Emma and Carly's profiles, so you can connect with them and keep an eye on when more research comes out. And like Emma said, more stuff being repurposed. I do remember the building agile organizations was also in that list. So I guess at least there's some self-awareness around people knowing that more changes come in and they need to be prepared to deal with it. So that was one thing I remember from the report from reading it. Carly, it might make sense as well now. I know talent attraction is also something you saw in your research, but maybe tell us a bit about who you are, what Unleashed do, and what the research you're doing at the moment is.
Yeah, sounds good. So people always start with what they do. So I'm going to go rogue. I'm a mum of 2 under the age of 5. They are wonderful and full on. I am, as of this year, a skateboarder and open water swimmer, even in the cold weather. And I also happen to be people and culture partner at Unleashed. And I'm also an admin of a massive talent and people community called DBR. There's like 9,000 professionals in that. So people and culture Unleashed. So we Unleashed are essentially like a consultancy, but we partner with startups and scale-ups, so in the UK and Europe, and we work with them on all things people and culture. We kind of do a bit of an audit, work with you on a people strategy and set out a roadmap and then help you execute on it. Some companies are super small, have zero HR function, people function. Others are much bigger, and we're kind of working with people directors, CPOs, etc., on executing on some of this stuff. I guess the kind of core product is our retainer product, partnering a day a week with these different companies, but we also have a leadership development program called Leadership Unleashed, and we also do kind of bespoke projects on certain things like I&D, for instance, or leveling, or with some bigger companies as well. So that's what we do. And I've been there for a year, and it's been an incredible journey. I've worked with some amazing companies and still am working with some amazing companies so far. So it's awesome. So our research, basically, we wanted to understand just the challenges. We went out with a survey to our kind of community, people subscribe to our newsletter, other communities that we're in, asking, what are your top challenges? What are the most pressing challenges that you're seeing? Like top challenges for HR teams or people teams, and then top challenges just as an organization, seeing where that differentiates maybe a little bit. But then also understanding kind of internal capability of being able to deal or manage some of these challenges internally, whether they feel they have the capacity or capability to do so. And so some of the interesting findings. So the top 3 priorities that came out, and this is why we're kind of different, which is really interesting. So enabling incredible performance was number 1. The second one, music to your ears, Gary, as I said to you yesterday, is supporting growth and development in your teams. And then the third was developing great leaders and managers. And then quickly followed, I guess, the kind of the 4th and 5th were like communication and culture related, which I think was interesting, related to the information you shared earlier in this kind of today, basically. So yeah, enabling performance, supporting growth and development in their teams, developing great leaders and managers. But then the following kind of, again, sort of organization wide were number 1, enabling performance. Strong team communication is number 2, developing great leaders and managers number 3, and then number 4, attracting top talent. So again, like it's these things are coming up, and given, as I said, like the layoffs and stuff we've seen, I think the number 4 in there, attracting top talent, is particularly interesting. But I do wonder, I guess there's a few things. I've just got my notes here, sorry, as I'm looking over. So it's really quite fascinating. I think the final point, and I'll come back to some of my thoughts on the other bits in a second, but 70% of respondents said that they felt they didn't have the capacity or capability to tackle these people and culture challenges in their organizations, which is really, really, but I think that was the most kind of shocking stat I think I found. I think enabling performance, I'm not surprised by that statistic. We know that the UK has a massive problem with productivity compared to sort of Europe in general and things like that. And so actually really nailing performance, what does that look like and how do you enable that? And I think that a lot of it kind of stems from, the backbone of, I think, of some like performance and stuff is just really great conversations and really great leadership. And so, if you've got great leaders and great managers, I think other things kind of fall into place. So as long as you're really clear on what your aspirations and your goals are and what you're aiming for, and you're really clear on those things, what, the metrics that matter. If you've got great leaders and great managers, I think other things fall into place. And those conversations, I think, are the fundamental part and backbone of of great performance, basically. But yeah, I would love to hear what you both think on those points. It's just really interesting.
No, agreed. Emma, did you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Developing great leaders and managers. I'm totally with you on all of that, Carly. It enables so many other things, all of which we've been talking about actually today: culture, behaviours, feeling connected, feeling part of something, all of that type of good stuff, retention. And I guess if we were to kind of go even higher level, maybe enabling incredible performance and supporting growth and development could be all part of your employee value proposition, i.e. what are you doing to achieve both of those outcomes? So what is your offering around performance, development, growth, career planning, that type of thing? That is all part of your value proposition. And I guess being explicit about that as well. So yeah, I'm not surprised they're in there, just maybe a subset of our higher level themes, because obviously even talent attraction, I mean, there's so much that sits within that, clearly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think for me the interesting one is, again, it's that self-awareness. Like people were saying they don't have the tools or like the capabilities to maybe drive some of this change, and that's sometimes a hard thing to admit, but I think it comes from self-awareness. So it's nice to see that people understand the challenges and where they want to get to, but they also understand the limitations. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the full report. Like I said, there'll be links to Carly and Unleashed in the post podcast stuff, so you can follow along and see when sort of the full findings are ready. We're sort of like really nearly at the end now, so I think maybe I'll just ask you that final question I had around it, and it comes back to talent attraction actually, but I'm going to do a very shameless around it, and it comes back to talent attraction. Slight delay there. I was just going to say, I'm going to do a shameless plug. I'd love to connect with as many of you on LinkedIn as possible, so I'm going to put my needs to be customized LinkedIn URL in the chat, because it still has A7AB something on the end. But yeah, it'd be great to connect with some of you, and that way I'll share the links as well when they're all ready. But one thing we spoke about recently on an episode from an L&D perspective is, what do we do when we can't buy or borrow talent? So we've alluded to it a lot today. There's been hiring freezes, there's been redundancies. That means companies are losing valuable knowledge, but also they can't always buy or borrow the skills. They need to fill gaps. So it's about, how do we build it internally? So just a few minutes left, but I'd like to hear sort of from a HR perspective, if you have any thoughts on any of that.
We should be doing that anyway. Like, that's my personal view. You know, there's so much untapped talent within organizations, linking back to some of you just said, Carly, you know, enabling incredible performance, supporting growth and development. This all links to that. So yeah, clearly, you know, if there's less talent in the market, which, you know, people are going to want to stay in their jobs, obviously understand that right now, then you're going to have to grow and develop. But we should be doing that anyway. So, you know, you can't kind of use the current situation as an excuse, I suppose, as an HR director to have not done it before now, would be my view on things. But it is how you do that kind of quickly. And I guess it's back to that consciousness piece. So what are the kind of key skills that you need? There's lots of research out there from like the likes of the World Economic Forum around the skills for the future, but what do they mean in your context? Because they might not all be relevant. And a lot of them are softer, in inverted commas, because I actually don't think any skill is soft. You know, leadership as a capability is not a soft skill. You know, having the right communication ability is not a soft skill either. But what does that mean in your context? And, you know, where should you prioritize your focus? Because again, you're not going to be able to do everything straight away. So I think it comes back to asking, understanding, listening, and asking your managers, you know, that individual there for their career development, should we put them on secondment? You know, opening up new opportunities as well as some of those formal development pieces. But Carly, jump in.
No, I fundamentally agree. Like offer people opportunities to progress, and look, the clients and the companies we sort of work with, because they're kind of scaling, or they're kind of small and scaling, or scaling really quickly. There's lots of opportunities for people to move generally kind of around and kind of pick up like transferable skills and kind of move into different areas, because they identify a gap, and actually we can try those things. But we know there's a skills shortage, right? Like this is reported on, even in the current climate with, you know, layoffs and stuff that we're experiencing. We know there's a skill shortage. We know there's not enough, you know, data scientists, engineers, like it's nurses, like generally across the board, there are skill shortages. So anything as a company that you can do to support your team members and help them upskill in those areas that are useful to you as a business, but also help them grow as well, and maybe propel them into their next position, is incredibly valuable. And again, I come back to this kind of really great conversations, like having a really good growth conversation, understanding people's strengths, and so that they can move into roles that play to their strengths, and then giving them opportunities to kind of pick up different skills and think about different ways of learning as well. Like people approach learning in different ways. Some people like to read, some people like to watch, some people like, you know, learn by doing. There's lots of different approaches. So what kind of, you know, what materials can we put forward to give those can be put to individuals to be able to upskill. Like I'm a massive fan of Multiverse and what they've been doing for like digital apprenticeships. I think it's absolutely incredible. And kind of enabling, like they were talking about kind of breaking into financial services, for instance, and helping people who've worked in financial services somewhat can be quite a traditional environment, helping upskill in digital skills that are really more useful to that business and that environment, that industry, as they grow and kind of keep moving forward and keep up with the times. It's just, that's amazing. Yeah. I also heard there was for example, a different example. There's a platform that Albion VC have just invested in called 5 Minutes AI, which is basically like TikTok Insta stories, like short 5-minute videos of L&D platform, basically. So people absorbing content in really kind of short video format, super personalized and gamified. It's quite interesting. Everyone will have, different, depending on the generation as well, like how they want to learn. That will be, it's important to explore those options, I guess, and be aware of them.
Interesting. I've not heard of that. I'll have to check it out. It sounds like an interesting concept.
Yeah,
I'm not going to miss this segue. You just teamed me up perfectly, Carly, because Chi from Multiverse is actually one of the people joining us next week to talk about this learning in flat organizations. So Carly didn't even know that there. You've got a ringing endorsement for the next episode ahead of time. So that's always handy. But no, exactly. But yeah, I guess one final thought on what you both alluded to there. I had Lavinia from Offbeat on a little while ago, and she made this great point that we often talk about curation in terms of like, how do we curate content, but we can curate people and opportunities. So if we're doing like our job well as a HR and L&D team, speaking to people, understanding their problems, speaking to individuals and asking where they want to go next in their career, what skills do they want to develop, what current skills do they have that could be leveraged elsewhere. If the more we know that, we can connect people who want to grow a certain skill with an opportunity, and then everyone benefits basically. So I agree. If you're having good conversations, you're kind of maybe halfway there. But speaking of good conversations,
knowing your gaps, right? Knowing where you've got gaps in your company, really understanding where you are lacking, like that, and that requires a lot of self-awareness and understanding. And then carrying out things like talent mapping, for instance, to help support. And that is a really useful process to go through.
No, I agree. And unfortunately, our good conversation we've been having is about to come to an end because we've hit time basically. So I just want to say massive thank you, Emma and Carly. I really enjoyed that. It was cool to hear a different perspective on what was once 40-page PDFs to me, and I was able to read. So it's nice to maybe just get over that process a little bit by talking through it. So thanks a lot for today. Thanks everyone who could join us. Like I said, we're going to put everything in an email that will go out to you. And if you want to join us for future events, there'll be all the links you need in there as well. So just final time just to say thanks both.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. See you later.